Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I wanted to talk about something that is currently doing the rounds in the news regarding NATO and American withdrawal. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've recently stumbled across, it's not just on CBS, but all the major news outlets are carrying this article or, these events because they are fairly important events in the grand scheme of things. Now, we all know that Donald Trump for a while has been going on about the United States pivoting away from Europe. It's been revealed in their national security doctrine, their foreign policy doctrine, that they're going to be embracing the Monroe Doctrine and pivoting more towards their neck of the woods as opposed to being the policeman all over the world. So with that said, it was inevitable that some of their responsibilities within NATO would then be shifted to the Europeans, because Donald Trump has mentioned that they need to steam ahead with implementing budget allocations for increased defense measures by Europe into NATO. Now, once again, I say this doesn't come as much surprise because, earlier on, late last year, the Americans mentioned that the Germans needed to then start taking the helms of NATO and that they need to be prepared for the more important duties that the Americans were carrying out to be handed over to the Germans. And the Americans signaled their intent to pivot away from Europe. And what you see now is actually playing out.
The message is clear. Washington wants Europe to shoulder more of its own defence. A Reuters report says the Pentagon told European diplomats that nations have until 2027 to take over most of NATO's defence capabilities. That's everything from intelligence to missiles and troop deployments, roles the US has dominated for decades. If they don't, the US could decide to stop participating in some NATO defence coordination mechanisms. The Trump administration's pressure on NATO allies is nothing new. In March, Trump had already questioned whether he'd defend countries that don't spend enough.
Well, I've said that to them. I said, if you're not going to pay, we're not going to defend. I said that 7 years ago. And because of that, they paid hundreds of billions of dollars. I said, if you're not going to pay your bills, we're not going to defend you.
The Pentagon staff who set the deadline haven't laid out how the US would measure Europe's progress. But European officials say 2027 is unrealistic. Even the EU's own 2030 target for military self-reliance is seen as ambitious, and many key US capabilities can't be replaced quickly. Washington's relationship with NATO runs hot and cold. Back in June, Trump was applauding European leaders for backing a plan to raise defence spending to 5% of GDP. But in the months since, he's shown a willingness to negotiate with Russia over the war in Ukraine. And his Deputy Secretary of State told NATO foreign ministers this week it was obvious Europe should take primary responsibility for its own security.
So I'm going to read some snippets of an article that appeared in CBS News. And it's NATO to shift 2 commands from US to European leadership amid Trump's demands that NATO give more to its defense. Now, once again, it's no secret. Donald Trump has mentioned that Europe needs to be responsible for Europe's own defense. Europe sponging off the United States is now over. And you find that sentiment is also being echoed largely within the United States populace, who feel that they've sacrificed and given a lot of money to NATO to help the Europeans. All the while, the Europeans were using the money that they should have put into NATO into other frivolous policies like, reassignment, gender reassignment surgery, immigration issue, bringing people in, housing them. And it's come at the cost of not only the European taxpayer, but the American taxpayer as well. because while Europe has shirked its responsibilities regarding NATO, those funds that could have been allocated to NATO for the defense of Europe were now redirected to these insane, disastrous policies. So you do find pushback from the American populace as well. The article goes on, as President Trump continues to press Europe to contribute more to its own defense, NATO announced 2 joint force commands would transition from US leadership to European in the coming years. So this is something that is going to be phased in, but the move is already in play. Now, a move like this is strategic. It's long term, and I'm very skeptical that it will be walked back by any subsequent administration coming in, because it's a major step. I think that gradually, as the Americans come to terms with the fact that they are fed up of having to bail Europe out, you will find that subsequent administrations will be held hostage to this policy because of what the populace think. The move is part of a shift to more fairly sharing responsibility within NATO, with European allies taking on greater leadership roles in NATO's command structure, NATO said in a statement ahead of a meeting of defense ministers this week. The statement also noted that the US would continue to maintain the role of Supreme Allied Commander Europe, or SACEUR, as part of making clear the US commitment to NATO command and control. So, the fact that NATO has published this on their website is an admission, number one, that they haven't been playing ball, that they've been lackadaisical, that they wanted NATO to continue. They see it as something viable. However, they've pushed the responsibility of maintaining that entity, namely NATO, squarely into the hands of the United States. And, I remember when Donald Trump first pitched the idea, it was laughable. Everybody thought it was a joke, how insane. But when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, it was an unfair deal if the Europeans were not playing their part in this game. After all, the Americans don't require NATO to come and save them in the United States. It's actually the other way around. So this piggybacking of somebody else, we should be ashamed. The other thing is that NATO continues to posture itself as this relevant force. NATO is a defunct relic of the Cold War. The sooner people come to understand that, and the sooner NATO comes to understand that, I think the better for the entire world, because a lot of the issues that seem to be going on with the Russians stems from NATO expansion. NATO turned from this force that was meant to be an defensive force into an offensive force when they began the bombing campaigns in Kosovo, when they began enforcing no-fly zones over Libya. You suddenly find that NATO has now taken on a new role and forced a relevance by itself onto the world. There's no need for NATO. Are you basically saying that all these European countries are incapable of coming together at a time of crisis, that they actually need a body to manage and regulate them? Because if you ask me, that doesn't seem to be working. You've had the EU in operation for a damn long time, and they still can't get together on nuts and bolts issues, let alone what happens. When the Russians launched their special military operation in Ukraine, there's still, 4 years later, there's still dissension amongst the EU member state ranks as to how to move forward. You've had a plethora of stupid policies, idiotic politicians come through that door and just promulgate nonsense. And we still haven't gotten any closer to where they anticipated. And then the hubris and ego of the EU and NATO combined is unimaginable. I don't think there's any space in the universe to contain this ego, the hubris of this ego. Because having been defeated and thrashed by the Russians in Ukraine, the penny still hasn't dropped. We're still talking about more money. And how, Zelensky's nicked so much of money along with all his cronies. And we keep throwing money into that bottomless pit. I just don't understand. I think Donald Trump has realized that this Ukraine debacle is something that just needs to be over and done with, because there's no love lost for the Ukrainians. At the end of the day, why would somebody else be concerned about the average Ukrainian citizen when the man in charge of Ukraine, the man voted by Ukrainians to look after them and, to bring about peace and stability? Zelensky won on a peace vote. He was going to sit down with the Russians and make peace. So the man responsible for looking after his own people has thrown them under the bus, literally thrown them as cannon fodder to the Russians. Why on earth would somebody else then pick up that mantle? Because if he, being Ukrainian, cannot care about his own people, why should it be somebody else's job? The article further goes on to state that last month, the Trump administration released its national defense strategy, which emphasized that NATO allies should take the primary responsibility for Europe's defense as the US focuses more on defending the homeland and deterring China. So again, the United States is saying to NATO, to Europe, your defense is your responsibility. We've got other things to deal with, and basically, you need to look after yourself. The lead author of that strategy, Undersecretary for Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, is expected to attend the NATO Defense Ministerial this week instead of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. This is the first NATO Defense Ministerial Hegseth has skipped since taking office. Now, this is incredibly important because theoretically, Pete Hegseth would have been at this meeting. In times of past, it would always be attended by Pete Hegseth or the equivalent in his rank in the United States at that time. The fact that he has skipped it and sent his deputy signals that he just doesn't care. And if you look at the United States, their administration, between Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, and Donald Trump, they care less about what happens to Europe. Their main and primary concern and focus is the United States and threats to the United States and the well-being of the United States. It comes back to Henry Kissinger's words that to be an enemy of the United States is bad, but to be a friend is even worse. I paraphrase, but it's something along those lines. The United States does not have friends. It has strategic interests. And it's clear and evident. And when Macron gave his speech and tried to rally the leaders of Europe around them now being responsible for themselves and them building Europe into that powerhouse, I think there's still a denial within Europe. There's still that hope, like a little kid, hoping that Christmas Father is going to land at Christmas with their gift. And it's that same mentality you see in Europe, that the Americans have done this to them, treated them in this way, but there's still that hope that at some point the United States will sweep in and save them. In a way, it's a good thing that this has happened, because now the Europeans realize that all their posturing on the world stage and everything they've been going on about is now right at their doorstep. The Americans are saying to them, we are in charge. It's our way or the highway. Follow suit or get left behind. And since they're not prepared to play ball on a lot of issues, this is the result. I think that the writing is on the wall, and they're basically praying for this 4-year term of Trump's to end before they can then look at dealing with a new, probably more amicable administration. However, I state again that this new administrations and subsequent administrations that come in after Donald Trump are going to follow a very similar pattern, because now America is pivoting towards what it was when it was founded. They have this vision of being a manufacturing behemoth again. They're taking on the Chinese. They're taking on everybody. And I think the sooner countries in the world understand that and realize that now is the time they need to do what's in their country's best interest and just form alliances that are based on strategy rather than on ones that are directed by your the tug on your heartstrings, I think you'll be a much more successful country and administration representing your people rather than one that feels that, oh, big brother America will always come to our aid. That's not going to happen. This world has proven that it's about strategic alliances. It's not just the Americans, it's all over the world. A lot of what is going on the world stage doesn't seem to make sense. It just doesn't seem to make sense because you have alliances with enemies in one camp and then suddenly you find enemies become friends in another conflict zone. It just doesn't make sense. So again, this shift, this pivot by the United States from NATO is a huge deal, and Europe now is being forced to get its house in order. The article further goes on. The decision strengthens the alliance by showing European leadership in European defense and enhancing European defense capabilities, the official said in a statement. The command in Norfolk, Virginia, has facilities on a larger installation that will remain under the control of the US Navy when a UK officer assumes command. According to its website, it is NATO's newest operational command and focuses on protecting the Atlantic and the Arctic. Again, he shifted the protection of the Arctic, and according to the deal that they did with Mark Rutte, that NATO needs to play a more pivotal role in that region. However, because we know the Americans have been eyeing Greenland for a very long time, they will still maintain control. So he's still holding the reins, but getting them to do what needs to be done, which in a way now, again, introduces and exposes to the world European subservience to the Americans. Macron talks about otherwise Europe will become a vassal. That is where I think he's wrong. Europe is and always has been a vassal of the United States. Italy will take over Joint Force Command Naples, while Germany and Poland will on a rotational basis share command of Joint Force Command Brunsum, currently led by Germany. Once the changes are made, all three Joint Force Commands that lead operations in crisis will be under European leadership. The US will take leadership of the Allied Maritime Command, which is currently led by a UK Vice Admiral. This means the US will lead the three functional commands: Allied Maritime Command, Allied Land Command, and Allied Air Command. So you see the Poles beginning to play a more active role in NATO, and I suspect that as the American withdrawal continues, Poland will continue to become this major force within European politics as well as NATO. Now, again, you have issues within Poland where you've got this push towards the current values that Europe is embracing. However, you have those trying to hold on to the Christian values of old that have always been around in Poland. So it's very interesting times ahead because you see Poland starting to posture against the Russians with what is happening on their border. And, again, I'm going to say that while NATO has this hubristic view of itself, I think that is only from within NATO. Whether it's the Poles, whether it's the British, whether it's the French, whether it's the Germans, the Italians, or a combination of the entirety of NATO, the rest of the world looks at them as a joke. Again, I'm going to say, if you think that Vladimir Putin trembles in his boots when he hears the word NATO, I think it's the other way around. I think he absolutely has a good laugh and says to Sergei Lavrov, these jokers, we just need to teach them a lesson. And if NATO continues pushing the way it is, because now Trump is giving them control of what, of a lot more control over NATO. If they continue this expansion towards Russia, I think an all-out war with Russia is an inevitability. I know Keir Starmer has been preparing for it and salivating at the thought of going to war. I don't know why, because he should be the first one on the front line. They should give him, one of those bayonet guns from the First World War and let him charge. Because it's brave to send somebody else's kid into war. Perhaps he should don a uniform and hold Zelensky's hand and run into into war together. But I suppose, being the coward he is, just like Zelensky, they'll probably be hiding in bunkers. I want to thank you for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode, and please remember to like, share and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.